Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Lalor. I'm the director of Ernst & Young's Africa Business Center. Well, it's good afternoon here in Johannesburg. I'm not sure what it is where you are. Thanks very much for joining us. I think what I'm going to try to do is cover our Africa Attractiveness Survey at a fairly superficial level of detail, so to give you more time to ask your questions. You will be sent, post this event, you'll be sent a copy of a slide pack as well as the actual document itself. I'm a bit wary about going into too much detail in an environment like this when you don't have anything in front of you. So if there's anything that you want to drill down into a little bit more detail or explore further, then obviously you can do so in answering or asking your questions. Just to give you a little bit of background, for those of you who don't know, this is our second Africa Attractiveness Survey after last year's inaugural edition. So, last year we declared it's time for Africa, and that was partly, I guess, a reflection at the time that despite all of the positive sentiment and optimism and the positive story around Africa, that certainly global FDI flows into Africa were still relatively low. It was at a point in time, I guess, when a lot of people had opinions about Africa, and what we sought to do was to consolidate those opinions to really get a consolidated view on perceptions around Africa, and then to back that up to see, are the actual numbers reflective of the perceptions out there. And this year we've looked to build on that. The purpose of the study really, again, is to build a better understanding of the perceptions, but also the realities of investment into and across Africa. To do that, we conduct a survey. So we conducted another survey with over 500 international business leaders, investors, and so on from across a range of countries, a range of sectors, a range of company sizes. So a really good sample. At the same time, we use data from FDI Markets database. It's a service of the Financial Times. It's the same service we use for our attractiveness surveys across other markets. And just to clarify the definition of FDI here, it really is a focus on long-term growth capital. It's a focus primarily on greenfield investment and expansion capital, so it doesn't include portfolio flows, which tend to be shorter term, and it doesn't include mergers and acquisitions. Those would be counted separately from this. So our focus is really on longer term growth investment, new capital coming into the continent, new projects coming into the continent, and the resulting socio-economic impact of those, primarily as a result of job creation. In addition, we've also commissioned supplementary research from Oxford Economics, which also helps to provide a kind of a more forward-looking view, I guess. And we then wrap a point of view around all of that. We do the analysis, we ask certain questions, and this year we've got, there's a lot of really rich analysis, a lot of really rich data, and that's why I say I'm really only going to skirt over the surface of it today and allow you to ask questions. And I think what I will offer at the end of our time together right now is that if you do want to have any sort of more detailed follow-up, we can always do that via email. You will be sent my contact details. So let me just jump into the overall highlights and recommendations coming out of our survey. Before I just pick out a few of the details that I'd like to focus on. Really 6 key messages that we're looking to highlight. One is that, generally speaking, there have been positive FDI growth trends since last year. So overall, the picture is, in fact, a very positive one. And I'll come back to that just now, or in a little bit later, just to kind of articulate what some of that growth looks like. I guess the but lurking in there is that despite the growth, there does remain lingering negative perceptions of the continent. And as we dug down into our survey results, it emerged that there are 2 very distinct groups of people, groups of investors. There are those who have a presence in Africa already, who have an investment, both African but global, companies invested in Africa, who are not just positive, but overwhelmingly positive about the continent. So they're not just positive, they say in relative terms, when we compare Africa as an investment destination to other investment destinations, regional investment destinations across the world, Africa is more attractive than any other place other than Asia at the moment for us. So that for us is a very positive message. In contrast, though, when we separate out those who don't have a business presence in Africa yet, it's a complete contrast. The view is overwhelmingly negative. For people with no business presence in Africa, in summary, Africa is the least attractive investment destination in the world, and by a long shot. So we talk about a perception gap here, but it's actually a chasm. It's so big. And part of what we wanted to ask this year was, what is it that those people who are investing in Africa, who are doing business in Africa, who are very positive about Africa, what is it that they know that those not yet invested in Africa don't know or don't get? And I guess that's when we talk about challenges and challenges that we as Africans face, certainly in terms of attracting the investment that we feel we require in order to accelerate growth and development on the continent. That's our first challenge. The first challenge is to address that perception gap. The positive side of that, though, is we've got a very positive story to tell. The story of Africa's progress is certainly over the last 20 years and accelerating over the last decade is a very positive one. And not just a positive economic story, it's a positive social and political story. And we feel that that story needs to be told more consistently and more confidently. So, that's probably challenge number one, that the perception gap needs to be bridged, and we as Africans need to be telling our story, telling our growth story more positively, more confidently, more consistently. The second challenge that we feel needs to be prioritized and addressed, if South Africa is going, not just South Africa, if Africa is going to step up into that Premier League of investment destinations, is the regional integration agenda. The big challenge, or one of the big challenges we still face as a continent in terms of attracting a critical mass of investment, is that it is a continent and not a country. There are 54 sovereign states that often result in fragmented markets, many markets that lack critical mass. So in order for us to capture the imagination of investors and for us to attract a greater share and a growing share of certainly of foreign direct investment, of growth investment, we need to be offering investors with larger markets, with larger critical mass. We need to make it easier to do business across borders. We need to make it easier to move skilled individuals and teams across borders and so on. So for us, the regional integration agenda is a critical challenge, and it needs to be prioritized. The third challenge, and very much a related one, is the infrastructure gap and the infrastructure deficit. Connecting both physically and if we talk about regional integration as I guess in a way the emotional and the relationship connector, there's also the physical connections that need to be built, and the infrastructure deficit across the continent remains a big challenge, not only to doing business, but in terms of creating markets with critical mass. And for us, the acceleration of bridging that gap will be a key enabler of regional integration, but also of growth and development. So those are 6 key messages. Generally positive growth trends in terms of FDI. Despite this growth, there remains these negative perceptions, but only for those not doing business in Africa yet. That the story of Africa's progress is not just economic, but also social and political, needs to be told more confidently and consistently. That challenges remain around regional integration and around infrastructure, and those need to be prioritized. But the 6th one is, and it's a really positive one for us, is that Africans are leading from the front. We are seeing a radical shift in terms of Africans taking ownership of their challenges. We're seeing a new generation of leaders, both in government and business, across the continent, really leading from the front. And in our research, it's illustrated by the growth in intra-African FDI, significant growth over the last while. 43% compound growth in intra-African investment over the last 4 years. It now represents 17% of of total FDI into and across the continent, and is being led by countries like South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. So that for us is a very positive story, and is part of what makes us very positive about the future of Africa. I'm not going to go down, as I said, into all of the detail, but what I do want to just sort of, I guess, focus on, and then maybe pause and take some questions up front, is just some of the specifically around some of the positive FDI growth trends. So just to share some of that with you and then pause. I guess if we're looking at year-on-year increases, the positive numbers, year-on-year from last year to this year, we've seen a 27% increase in the number of FDI projects into Africa. So that's been very good. In global terms, if we contextualize Africa versus other destinations, Africa's share of global projects has grown by 23%. So we've seen an uptick as a result of, whereas last year the total projects into Africa represented 4.5% of total FDI projects globally. This year it represents 5.5%. So that's a material shift. It's a positive movement. From our perspective, still not high enough, but it's certainly a big step in the right direction, and we've certainly gained ground as a result on other sort of I guess high-profile FDI destinations such as China and India, to name just two. So 27% growth in FDI projects, 23% in terms of the share of global projects. There's been a slight downtick in capital investment, so a reduction of 7% in capital investment. But we need to qualify that. So it might sound negative, but actually in context it's not negative. That's partly a result of the fact that globally there's been less capital investment. So partly a factor of just a smaller pool of capital being invested. But more importantly, it's a continuation of a trend we identified last year, which is the changing nature of investment into Africa. So the nature of the investment is shifting away from pure extraction and pure natural resources into far more diversified type sectors, into the service sectors and so on. And as a result, the other key number here is that there's been 16.5% growth in terms of jobs created, in the number of jobs created as a result of FDI investment. So the quality of the investment is improving as far as we're concerned. Investment going into less capital intensive sectors, but sectors that are creating more jobs than some of the more traditional sectors. So those are some of the positive numbers. If we look at the sector view, and just to sort of share a few highlights with you, there's been growth in terms of projects year on year pretty much across the board. We've seen substantial growth in what's categorized as metals and minerals sector, 47%, but a lot of that into manufacturing type activity, so into value added type activity. Substantial growth in communication, in consumer products, in financial services, in business services such as professional services and so on. So pretty much growth across the board to a greater or lesser extent, and as you can tell from just that sort of snapshot of sectors, certainly not concentrated in any sort of one or two sectors, and covering manufacturing, which has been a big job creator over the last few years, infrastructure related activities, the services, as well as of course natural resources. Similarly, we're also seeing increasingly diverse growth in terms of the country destinations. So whereas even a few years ago there was a very much a concentration on kind of 8 or 10 markets, and generally those markets were the oil-rich countries, Angola, Nigeria, the North African countries, and then South Africa as a sort of separate case. But generally FDI was dominated and has been dominated by a small number of markets. Certainly in the last kind of year on year, we're seeing strong growth in Zambia, in Ghana, in Botswana, in Mozambique, in Kenya, in fact pretty much across East Africa, Tanzania, South Africa itself. There's been strong growth as well, year on year, 53% growth. Nigeria less so, and we're measuring FDI projects here, but still good growth, around 35%. So there's no, again, it's not as if we can kind of pinpoint or identify one region or one group of countries or kind of one underlying factor that's driving this growth in investment. I mean, it's broad-based and it's diverse, which for us, in terms of sustainability, again, is a very positive story. Perhaps finally, just in terms of the highlights, is where's that investment coming from? So, sorry, I've got a screensaver. Sorry, the screensaver on this computer suddenly came on. In terms of where that investment is coming from, again, a very positive story in terms of overall sort of diversification and not a dependency on one or two markets. Last year, we certainly the trend that we saw was, and unsurprising to many of you, was that there was a shift towards greater investment from emerging markets into Africa and a gradual decline in investment from developed markets. But certainly this year, or year on year, we've seen a resurgence of investment from developed markets, particularly from markets like the US and the UK. And emerging market investment has held up well too. So certainly India and China have been at the forefront of that. But a strong growth in investment from countries like South Korea and from Turkey. So in absolute terms, if you want to talk about it like that, that's a growth of what? I mean, geez, I can't even do the maths on that. I mean, yeah, in absolute terms, that's significant growth. In compound terms, and we like to look at it from 2007, partly because of the impact that the global economic crisis has had. You know, we see that sort of 2007, 2008 as being a sort of significant break, and the trends since then are more, I guess, more meaningful in many ways in terms of looking ahead a few years than the longer term trend from 2003. So since 2007, we've seen intra-African or compound growth in intra-African investment, FDI, at a rate of 43%. So that's substantial growth, and it's being led out of South Africa. Cumulatively from 2003, South Africa is the sixth largest investor into Africa in terms of FDI projects. So it's off a fairly large base. And last year, over the last 4 years, there's been compound growth in the region of about 65% out of South Africa into the rest of the continent. And year on year, that growth was 69%. So strong growth in the last 4 years and in the last year off what is a relatively large base. But a strong growth as well in the last 4 years, particularly from Kenya and Nigeria. So Kenya and Nigeria are also cumulatively in the top 20 investors into the rest of the continent, and also the trend has been one of very strong growth. In fact, if South Africa's growth has been around about 65% in the last 4 years, I don't know the exact numbers, but both Kenya and Nigeria have been growing their investment at a rate of over 70%, perhaps even closer to 80% in the last 4 years. So that's a very positive story. And overall, as a proportion of investment from 2003 to 2011, in a period where total FDI has grown substantially, Africa's proportion of that FDI has also doubled. So from 8% in 2003 to close to 17% in 2011, intra-African FDI. And when we're talking about FDI, I just want to clarify this again, we're talking primarily greenfield investments. So it doesn't include acquisitions. It doesn't include mergers and acquisitions. It's primarily greenfield investment or expansion investment. So it might be where a company like SAB Miller, for example, may have a plant in Angola already, for argument's sake, and are investing in expanding that plant or putting down a new plant, whatever the case might be. So it would include expansion capital, but it's primarily investment capital. And in terms of the sectors, I'm not going to be able to talk to this in detail off the top of my head, but there's no doubt that there's a weighting towards service sectors. So less investment going into natural resources, into extractive type activities, and a lot more into sectors such as financial services, retail and consumer products, as well as telecommunications. Those would be sort of big focus areas for South African companies and for a lot of the investment coming out of Kenya and Nigeria as well. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Another question. Today, the rapid economic growth on the continent is not reflected in people's daily life. What are the steps and actions you're looking to take in order to allow local population to increase their level of living? I think that's a very good observation. So again, I might be losing something in the translation. I guess as Ernst & Young, as a professional services firm, we offer, we are in a certain kind of business, and we are certainly proponents firstly we would say we are unashamed Afro-optimists, and we are looking to position Africa globally and in the context of being a global firm with our global clients as a preferred investment destination. But certainly on in terms of our on-the-ground impact, we as Ernst & Young aren't having a direct impact on people's lives. So I just want to make sure that I understand, or that I'm differentiating between Ernst & Young and more broadly what's happening. I think the point's well made that it takes time for the broad macroeconomic growth story to filter through into people's daily lives. But certainly when we look at, and what we've done is we've included in our report this year some commentary around the progress, the social and political progress that Africa is making, because we feel it's important for us to be telling that story in the context of the perception gap that still exists. And there's no doubt that when one looks at the objective fact-based studies and one looks at the trends over time, and so one of those that I'm picking on now is some research that the World Bank had commissioned and was conducted by the Development Prospects Group, that looks at the rate of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and looks at the trend of that rate of poverty over time. Now the threshold level that they put in place as in terms of the poverty line, I guess, is $1.25 a day, which clearly is is a fairly low threshold. But in 1995, 60% of people in sub-Saharan Africa were living beneath that threshold. 60% of Africans were living beneath the threshold of $1.25 a day. Given the progress that's been made and the forecast looking forward, factoring in the impact of the global economic crisis, by 2015 that percentage or that proportion would have come down to 38%. Now that's still 38% of Africans living beneath $1.25 poverty line. That's a substantial number, but let's not lose sight of that progress that's been made over time. The challenges, Africa's challenges and our challenges as Africans around poverty, around unemployment, around socio-economic development are very real, and I don't think any of us can kind of gloss over those. But the message that we want to come through very strongly is that strong progress is being made towards addressing those challenges. We still got a long way to go, but strong progress is being made towards addressing those challenges. And if we can lift levels of foreign direct investment, it's not a panacea, it's not the silver bullet that's going to cure it all, but it's certainly going to be a key accelerator of growth and of development and of broader kind of socio-economic impact. So that's really the more focused message that we hope comes through quite strongly in our report this year. What role can intra-Africa trade play in increasing diversification of export products away from minerals and hydrocarbon products? That's a tough question. I mean, I think it's a complex question that warrants a complex answer. But let me just try what role can intra-Africa trade play in increasing the diversification away from, let's just say, natural resources or dependency on natural resources? Let me first make the point, or let me preface the answer by saying that the trend we've seen in terms of FDI into the African continent has been very much a story of diversification. So for us as a lead indicator, that's a very positive indicator that the interest and the economic opportunity that investors are seeing and are seizing is diversifying quite rapidly away from, certainly from pure extractive activities. So we're seeing a very strong growth in investment into the manufacturing sector, into infrastructure-related projects, and into service-related sectors. So that would cover quite a broad base, including communications, business services, consumer products, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth. So the overall trend from an FDI perspective is a very positive one. I guess part of our challenge, and why for us the regional integration agenda is such an important one, is that many African economies are still are structurally locked into relationships that are centuries old, that were forged during colonial times. So intra-African trade, if we're talking about trade, is still at relatively low levels. It's around about, it's probably averaged around about 12% over the last decade. It was up to about 13% in 2010. So that is certainly problematic if you compare intra-Asian trade, for example, which sits at about 50%, or a regional trade in South America, which accounts for about 30%. And what regional trade does, or intra-regional trade does, is it helps create domestic markets. It's not just about a diversification play, it's about local independence, or independent domestic markets that drive growth locally and provide, over and above the resources that we've been blessed with, and the boost that the commodity booms gives to our economic growth. It creates long-term sustainable domestic growth, which accelerates growth, it accelerates development, and it makes it more sustainable. It kind of diversifies the sources of that growth. So at a high level, there's no doubt that increasing intra-African investment and increasing intra-African trade is a positive thing, is going to drive diversification, and this is why this requires a long answer. There are substantial barriers to that, and I don't want to get into those today, but certainly it's certainly why for us regionally, if we have to look at across the challenges that we face as Africans, regional integration, we would suggest, needs to be prioritized as one of the top 3 challenges that needs to get addressed and prioritized over the next few years. I'm going to take another question now. So if anybody wants me to focus more specifically on something that I haven't addressed in answering your questions, let's come back to that. For companies looking to enter the African market, what are some of the risks they worry about, and how can they mitigate these risks? So it's interesting. Let me go back to the point that I made about this. Talk about a perception gap. Let's talk about a perception chasm between those who have invested in Africa, who have been here, who understand the operating environment, they understand the challenges, and who are very positive about Africa and about Africa's attractiveness relative to other regions and other sort of investment destinations. Let's park those people for now, and let's focus on those people who are not doing business in Africa yet, who haven't made what seems like a leap of faith, who haven't put down any kind of investment into the continent, and are overwhelmingly negative. So what is it that hinders them from investing? And we ask that direct question. 3 things come through very strongly. Certainly political risk overall is a key perceptual barrier to investing in Africa. So there are strong perceptions that remain that Africa is politically unstable. There are perceptions that that corruption is rampant across Africa, that in fact Africa is inherently corrupt. That's the second one. And the third one is probably that Africa is inherently a more challenging place to do business than any other region in the world. So those are probably the three sort of high headline challenges that come through time and time again in terms of risk perceptions. I think what we try to do in our report is place those perceptions of risk in context. Is to say, look, if you're going to, the risk is always relative. Risk is relative to return, and it's relative to perceived risk in this context in other regions. So let's start by firstly understanding that Africa, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but that Africa is not a country, it is a continent, and it's a continent of 54 not only sovereign states but very diverse sovereign states. And one needs to understand that the range of both challenge and opportunity across those 54 sovereign states is on both spectrums of the scale. So if we wanted to take corruption, for example, and talk about corruption in Africa, one actually needs to take it down a couple of layers and talk about corruption relative across the continent, where you've got countries, I mean, we mentioned Botswana earlier, countries like Botswana or Mauritius, or to some extent even South Africa for that matter, who, when one benchmarks those countries on any objective scale, let's use Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, for example, against other emerging markets, actually perform very well. There are something like 13 or 14 African countries that rank ahead of India on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and something like 34 or 35 African countries that rank ahead of Russia. So let's firstly have the conversation in the right context, and secondly, let's just understand that there are countries in Africa that rank as high as any other emerging market, but there are also countries in Africa that rank right at the bottom. And our challenge, if we're coming back to the perception gap, unfortunately for us as Africans, is that too often Africa is associated with the lowest common denominator and not the highest common denominator. So people they talk about political instability, and what do we see in the press? We see what's happening in Mali, we see what's happening in South and North Sudan, and that personifies Africa this year. We don't look at the numerous elections that are happening across the continent. We don't look back at the election that happened towards the end of last year in Zambia, for example, where there was a peaceful transfer of power. It's not that is highlighted or spoken about. We don't look at countries and the progress that's been made politically, economically, socially, etc., across a diverse range of countries. Name them: Ghana, Nigeria, Botswana, Mauritius, South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, you name them. Those aren't the countries we talk about. We talk about what are increasingly the exception rather than the norm, but those come to personify Africa. So, sorry, I've got on a bit of a soapbox there, diverted a bit from the actual question, but I think it is an important point that risk is largely about perception, and the perception of risk in Africa in many instances is not the actual risk that people experience when invested and doing business in Africa. When doing business in Africa, the risks aren't hugely different to the risks that one would face in any other emerging market region. I guess what frames the challenges in Africa are probably the fragmented nature of many of the markets, because there are 54 different countries doing business across those borders, the infrastructure, relative underdevelopment of infrastructure, the skills gap. Those are operational challenges, operational risks that business people can get their head around and can deal with. And that's why there's this massive gap between those doing business in Africa who understand the risk, but they also understand the returns they can get out of Africa, and so are very positive about their ability to manage those risks. And those who just haven't made that leap of faith yet because they're still stuck in an Africa that is captured on, for example, the cover of The Economist in 2000, which has the picture of a child with an AK-47 and has a headline reading, "Africa, the hopeless continent." And The Economist itself, had that article last year where they denounced that entire, I guess, discourse. Africa's moved way beyond that, and yet there are still too many people whose perception of risk in Africa are stuck in that time and space, whether it's in the mid-90s or early 2000s, and they just haven't moved on from there. Sorry, I hope I answered that question. East African community states, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, are in great discoveries. There have been great discoveries of oil and gas. But the challenge is that they do not have enough capital and have poor technology. What should they do to benefit from these discoveries? It's a good question, that. I guess, from our perspective, that's why we certainly view foreign direct investment as a force for good, as a positive force. And the danger, I guess, is that, and I think this is, from our perspective, the exception rather than the norm, where foreign investment or foreign investors become sort of exploitative. They look for the opportunity, they take as much as they can out of it, and then they leave, and they leave chaos in their wake. And that's partly, it's a big part of why when we look at foreign direct investment, we look at specifically growth capital, long-term growth capital investment, and we look at the socio-economic impact. So we look at the jobs that are being created. I certainly don't believe that the oil and gas discoveries, the recent, I guess the sort of the one a little while ago in Lake Victoria, but the more recent ones in the sort of Rift Valley between Kenya and Ethiopia, those are hugely exciting. And a company like Lalor Oil, for example, that has been at the forefront of new discoveries in Ghana and developing kind of developing those, I think has been a force for good. Certainly a force for good in Ghana. I think is a force for good in Uganda, and will be a force for good in other parts of East Africa. It's bringing capital, it's creating jobs, it's putting down roots for the long term, and it's making long-term commitments. I'm not don't want to get into a debate in this forum, but I think overall and overwhelmingly, the long-term private sector investment going into countries and into regions like East Africa is a force for good, and will provide the capital as well as the skills, both short-term and longer-term in terms of short skills transfer, to help unlock that kind of value and create sort of, I guess, mutually beneficial and sustainable value over time. Clearly the regulatory framework has to support both the company that's looking to invest, but also the local population who needs to benefit from that investment over the longer term. Again, making sure that the investment is benefiting not just a few fat cats, be they in business or government, but is flowing through to communities and creating jobs and creating economic impact down the supply chain and so on. Certainly from our perspective, the large majority, certainly our clients that are investing into Africa are doing so with that kind of mindset, with that kind of intent. A major concern for Western companies is the extent to which the continent is open with regard to information, regulations, laws, judicial practice, and enforcement of contractual obligation. What strategy do you recommend for managing these challenges? So, I'm going to make the assumption that the question is that the continent is open with regard that there's let's just say that the regulatory environment is fluid, is immature, that it's often difficult to enforce contracts, that the laws or the legal system can be a little bit fluid. I'm assuming that that's what the question is, and then as a follow-up, how does one sorry, the question's gone off my screen now, but how does one I guess kind of mitigate these factors or get one's head around these factors? I don't have an easy answer to that. There's no doubt that for us, if I sort of focus in on the regulatory and compliance environment generally, is a very challenging one. Not necessarily because it's chaotic or it's less well developed than in some other regions in the world and so on. I think it's more that, for a start, as I've said several times now, you're dealing with 54 sovereign states, and if you're doing business in Africa, because of the nature of the market, because it's going to be difficult to find critical mass in any other than a few markets in Africa. Almost by definition, you're going to be doing business across border. That in itself, just raises the level of complexity in an environment where regulation and compliance can already be quite complex because of the different states of maturity in certain countries, the different levels of implementation, and so on and so forth. So it's a big challenge. I'd love to have an easy sort of crib sheets, York Notes type answer to it. Certainly for us, you almost I guess two dimensions to it. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. You need to understand at a level of detail each individual country that you are considering entry into or looking to enter into. And for us, the the regulatory challenge, or understanding the regulatory framework, which would include tax and related issues, which in some jurisdictions would be approached as almost an afterthought or an operational issue. For us, it's very much a strategic challenge in the African context, and should be at the forefront of the initial, let's call it, broad due diligence type process when one is considering the relative attractiveness of different markets. So it's important to understand the detail on a market by market basis and the implications of that for you at a market by market basis, but equally one needs to step back from that and very early on develop an operating model for Africa, or a sub-regional operating model that takes into account the differences in operating across those markets, because as I said earlier, invariably, almost by definition, one is going to be operating across border in Africa. It obviously helps to have advisors such as ourselves, and this is not a sales pitch. I mean, it just helps to have advisors such as ourselves who have a presence on the ground, who understand the regulatory environment, who understand where it has been and where it's moving towards, and can also help clients, and certainly our global clients, in connecting the dots across those continents. So I don't think Africa is a continent to enter into without substantial on-the-ground support from professional advisors and probably from JV type partners as well, in many instances. Litigation is an interesting issue across Africa. What can companies do to hold on to their best, and how can we ensure there's a greater viable pool of potential domestic employees? It's a very good question. I mean, clearly, certainly one of the big challenges, and it's one that doesn't come through strongly in this year's report, but I've got no doubt it's going to be one of the key themes in next year's report, is around the human capital challenge, the skills challenge, the talent challenge. I mean, you know, when we talk to many of our clients, most of our clients, it is a challenge. I mean, it is a challenge finding the right skills in the right markets, particularly technical skills and managerial skills with the right levels of experience. So I think particularly in the early stages of setting things up and getting things going, many of our clients who are investing into the rest of the continent, or into the continent, find that quite challenging. And to build a brand as an employer of choice in markets can also be quite challenging. And clearly, when you've got a relatively small pool of highly skilled talent who've got, and increasingly have got choices, because global multinationals are coming into those markets, you know, it makes it sort of doubly difficult, I guess, to attract that talent. Certainly, what you know, in terms of attracting talent, I mean, let's just talk about that, because I mean, this is obviously a big conversation in itself. But a few of the sort of, let's call it, sort of under-tapped resources, I guess. One is the diaspora. Certainly, and if I can talk from our own experience, we are seeing an increasing number of Africans returning home, and certainly where we've, for example, built up our practice over the last few years in Ethiopia, for example. I think our entire partnership in Ethiopia is are you know, what one might call expats, I guess, who've returned home primarily from the US. So have been, in some instances, grown up, educated, have worked for 10, 20 years in the US, and are now returning home. We've recently opened our offices in Cameroon and have brought back 2 native Cameroonians, but who have spent, you know, 10, 20 years working in France, and I think that pattern we're seeing that certainly play out in market after market. So the you know, one of Africa's, I guess, greatest exports over time has been people, and certainly we need to be working hard to bring those people back. I think the other factor here is, and it's challenging at the moment, kind of moving people across borders, but certainly some of our clients and ourselves are working hard to look at our pool of African talent as opposed to talent in specific countries, and trying to ensure that we are able to move the right people to the right places, but leveraging African talent. So for us, we might have a project in Nigeria, for example, with a global multinational, and ideally we would draw on our resources in Nigeria, but where we might be lacking a certain skill set or whatever, or industry specialization or something, we'd pull in people from Mauritius, for example, or Zimbabwe, for example, or South Africa, for example. And often we've got teams from across 4 or 5 countries working on projects in another country. And I think that's increasingly the model that we'll start to see some multinationals moving towards. And obviously, as immigration policies improve, and as the regional integration process takes hold in terms of the ability to move certainly professionals and skilled individuals across borders, we'll start to see a lot more of that. So I guess my short answer to the question is that often the pools of domestic talent are small, and so you're competing for a small. We need to start thinking differently about how we increase those the talent pool generally and specifically, and those are two ideas certainly that we are pursuing. I think this is the last question. Oh, sorry, that was the last question. And a press release is going to be issued within 30 minutes, and I think we'll also send out the report and a PowerPoint pack. I'm assuming that either my personal details or our the details of our media contact will be made available. So if anybody's got any sort of specific questions, or you'd like any specific follow-up, by all means, we might not respond to them immediately, but we'll respond to them as quickly as possible. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.